Okay, I think it's time to get started. It's 7:04. I just want to say thanks for everybody who has joined us tonight for our hope-mongering session. Tonight we have a very special guest, a very close friend of camp, Dana. Is it VanBuecken? How do you say that?
VanBuecken. No, that was good. It's
I got
Dutch.
it. I got it. I
You're
remember.
good.
Yeah, so Dana came out to adult camp this year. Dana has type 1 herself. I will let her introduce herself, but she'll go through a presentation of different research topics, including the TrialNet, which I know a lot of people are interested in. Dana, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Rob, for having me. I'm going to minimize my video so I can't see myself talking. I just want to start off by saying that I love the name of this group. I feel like Hope-Mongering is perfect because we are in this golden age of diabetes research where we've had so many advances in the past 10 years with our technologies and with risk screening, with cell therapies, with different immunologic treatments for type 1 diabetes. And so, I mean, the amount of progress that we've made is immense. So we can't obviously touch on all of that tonight. So we've decided to really try and focus in on diabetes risk screening. We'll talk about what that is. We'll talk about what we've learned from some of our risk screening programs and some of the recommendations for screening family members. So you already gave a beautiful introduction. I just wanted to mention that I don't have anything to disclose apart from the fact that I have type 1 diabetes myself. You can see here on the left, this is me on day 1 of type 1 diabetes. I was 22 years old, just out of college. This is my now husband and my mom and mother-in-law. And this was, the first step of the journey for me. If you fast forward 16 years, this is me now with my 4 kiddos, and we are TrialNet advocates, and I will talk a little bit more about what that means in a second here. When I am not working as a research nurse practitioner, I am very passionate about advocating for affordable insulin, and that has led me to some pretty cool places. So this is a picture of one of the last State of the Unions where some of us with type 1 diabetes were trying to give a voice to that advocacy movement. I work at Benaroya Research Institute in Seattle. We are a nonprofit biomedical research center, and our whole goal is to learn more about autoimmunity, what causes autoimmunity, how can we develop better treatments, better technologies for autoimmune conditions. We have 29 different labs, and we do have a unit on the 8th floor of Virginia Mason Hospital in downtown Seattle. We do trials for adult and pediatric populations, and we travel people from all over. So we have patients from Alaska, Washington, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Utah. And this is some of the clinical team when we were working on the Pfizer vaccine trials the last couple of years. That's been a big focus, as you can imagine. All right, so tonight we will do a little immunology 101. I know most of you listening could probably talk about the pathophysiology behind type 1 diabetes yourselves, but we'll just briefly touch on that little review. We'll talk about TrialNet's risk screening program, and we'll talk about what we've learned about the risk of progression in our higher risk populations, and then prevention trials for those at risk. I also wanted to point out we do have a QR code. If you're interested in learning about any of the studies that we talk about, TrialNet in general, you can scan this with your phone. It will take you to a little page where you can give us your contact information, and you can let us know what you would like to learn more about, and we'll reach out to you and see if we can offer more information. So I'll give this again at the end of the presentation. So if you don't have your phone with you, there's no pressure. All right, so throughout this talk, I am going to be using a case study. So I am going to ask that you would think back to diagnosis. This can be your diagnosis with type 1 diabetes. This can be the diagnosis of a child, family member, friend. So just think back to that day or that time. When we tell people that they have type 1 diabetes for the first time, Often, this is the first question we get. People want to know, what did we do wrong? Was there something in my diet? Was there something that I was exposed to? Was there something that I should have done that I didn't do that led me to get type 1 diabetes? So we're going to go back to, again, this is our Immunology 101, Pathophysiology 101. We know that with type 1 diabetes, the problem is within the pancreas. And within the pancreas, we have thousands of these little pancreatic islets. Each islet is full of endocrine cells, alpha cells, beta cells. The beta cells are responsible for insulin production. And with type 1 diabetes, we have these little T cells. This is a subset of the immune system that attack the beta cells and cause the beta cells to lose the ability to secrete insulin. Obviously, when we lose that ability to make insulin, we're also losing the ability to metabolize glucose. So normally our T cells not normally, even in type 1 diabetes, our T cells continue to be a very important part of our immune system. They help to protect us against infections and foreign organisms. Again, in type 1, they mistakenly attack the beta cells as if they are foreign. And when we get to the point where we have less than 20% of our beta cells that are functional, or 20% of our islets that are functional, we start to develop symptoms of type 1 diabetes. And this is when most people are diagnosed. So when people ask us, hey, what did we do wrong? How did my child develop type 1 diabetes? We can honestly answer, this is an autoimmune disease. You didn't do anything wrong. We then often get this question, could we have known about her diabetes earlier before, she got to the point where she only has 20% of her beta cell reserve left? So we wish that we could use our superhero vision and look into the pancreas and see these autoreactive T cells at work. But we can't. The only window we currently have into the pancreas is through a blood test. And unfortunately, there are too few of these islet attacking T cells to detect easily on that blood test. So in other words, even if someone had autoimmunity ongoing in their system, we might miss it if we just were to look for these T cells with a blood test. So we have to look for something else. So we look to another part of the immune system. In a normal functioning body, the B cells help direct the T cells to tell them where they should go. So in this little illustration here, we have the B cell wearing his little blue top hat. He's holding up a sign of this germ and saying, hey, T cell, this is something that's foreign. You need to go and attack this. In type 1 diabetes, the B cells send the wrong messages and they direct the T cells to go to the islets. So again, you can see in our illustration, he's holding up a sign of the islets. He's saying, okay, T cell, this is foreign. Go and take this out. So we can reliably find evidence of these wrong messages in our bloodstream. And many of you may know what these wrong messages are called. I don't know if anyone wants to yell out. Does anyone know what these are? It's okay if you don't. These are our diabetes autoantibodies. Many people are tested for these at diagnosis. So I know that was the case for myself. This may be something that you can find in your lab work. We now recognize 5 different autoantibodies that are associated with type 1 diabetes, and their names are here. And we also know that 95% of children who develop type 1 before puberty will have these antibodies detectable by the time they're just 5 years old. So these show up typically very early on. We've also seen that antibodies can appear many years before diagnosis. So we had a couple of weeks ago, one of our participants in the clinic, and he first tested positive for autoantibodies when he was 3 years old. He tested positive for 3 of them. He's now 19 years old, and he hasn't yet developed clinical type 1 diabetes or symptomatic type 1 diabetes, but he's still testing positive for these autoantibodies. We're still monitoring him for diabetes symptoms. And again, he's had antibodies in his system for 16 years, so they can show up very early on. We also know that when someone tests positive for at least 2 autoantibodies, they have almost a 100% chance of developing symptomatic type 1 over the course of their lifetime. So said another way, 2 autoantibodies is now considered to be stage 1 type 1 diabetes. All right, so if this is stage 1, what are the other stages? So we'll go over those briefly. Again, stage 1, you're positive for 2 or more of those autoantibodies. At this point in time, your blood sugar normal levels are normal, and people typically don't have any symptoms, right? Because your blood sugar is normal. In stage 2, you maintain positivity for those 2 autoantibodies, but we start to see some abnormalities in your body's ability to metabolize glucose. So that can be an abnormal fasting glucose, that can be an abnormal OGTT, that can be a blood glucose above 200 2 hours after you eat. But we do start to see some changes. We can also start to see the A1C drift up a little bit in stage 2. But again, people usually remain asymptomatic in this stage. At stage 3, again, people are positive for these autoantibodies, and this is when people meet the diagnostic criteria set forth by the American Diabetes Association. So at this point in time, A1C is at least 6.5%, your fasting blood sugar will be above 126, or you'll have a random glucose above 200, or a diabetic OGTT. And this is, again, when most people start to develop symptoms or symptoms present. And then finally, stage 4 is long-standing type 1 diabetes. So again, I've had diabetes 16 years. I am most definitely in stage 4 at this point. So we know after almost 20 years of TrialNet research that the more types of islet autoantibodies we can detect in someone's system, the greater likelihood of developing clinical diabetes. So if we find just one of the diabetes autoantibodies in someone's blood work, their risk of type 1 diabetes over the next 10 years is only 10%. If they have 2 autoantibodies, that risk jumps up to 60%. If they have 3, 70%, 4, 85%. And if they test positive for all 5 autoantibodies, their risk of clinical type 1 over the next decade is greater than 95%. So it's very high. We also know that there is a huge impact of age on disease progression. So the younger someone is when we first detect these autoantibodies, the more rapidly they will progress through the stages of type 1 diabetes and develop those symptoms. And this should illustrate that for us with the younger individuals progressing more quickly to symptomatic type 1. There are a couple of different theories about why this might be. Some people think that with a smaller person, we have smaller pancreases, we have fewer beta cells to begin with, and so those beta cells can be depleted more rapidly. Other people think that there may actually be a more aggressive disease course in younger individuals as opposed to people who are diagnosed in adulthood. And that's something that we're really still learning about. So when our family member asks, could we have known about this earlier? We can answer, we can now detect type 1 diabetes before symptoms develop, and we can do this by testing for diabetes autoantibodies. This father then asks, okay, so since I have one child with type 1 diabetes, are my other family members also at risk? So we will dive a little bit into genetic risk for type 1 diabetes. We know that the general population risk for type 1 is about 1 in 300. So in a typical elementary school up here of 600 students, we can expect that there should be about 2 students with type 1 diabetes. Now, if you have a family member with type 1, and that can be a first or second degree family member, so brother, sister, mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, cousin, niece, nephew, your risk of type 1 diabetes will jump up to 1 in 20. So said another way, family members are at a 15 times greater risk of developing diabetes. Because of that elevated risk, family members are eligible for free screening, free autoantibody screening through TrialNet and other testing programs. So how can family members be screened? The easiest way is to sign up for a test kit at trialnet.org. And I've included the link here in blue. When you go to that link, you can sign up to receive an in-home test kit. That's something that TrialNet will mail to you. You can collect a blood sample at home via finger stick, and then you mail the blood sample back to TrialNet. And that's all done free of charge. This is how I tested my kiddos for autoantibodies. And everyone's children are different, but for my kiddos, it was very helpful to have a movie playing in the background. It was also very helpful to warm their bodies up before we collected the blood sample. So I gave everyone a very hot bath or hot shower before we did the finger stick to kind of open those blood vessels up, get the blood flowing. And it worked really well for us. So this is a good fit, obviously, with COVID still going on in the community. It will keep you from having to go into a clinic. You can do everything from home. Some people prefer not to do a finger sticker on their own children for a gamut of different reasons, all of which are very valid, and they might prefer to have a lab test kit mailed to them. So same thing, TrialNet will send the kit, they can take it to a local lab where a phlebotomist will actually do a blood draw, collect blood in a tube, and then again, mail it back to TrialNet free of charge. And then the last option is to come to a TrialNet site for a blood draw. There are over 200 sites across the country, and OHSU is a site for this. I think that's probably the closest site to most of you. To be eligible for this TrialNet screening, you have to be at least 2.5 years old and up to 45 years old with a first degree relative, or you can be between 2.5 and 20 with a second degree relative. And usually it takes about 1 month to receive your antibody results. So a lot of people ask, okay, I know an in-home test kit is available, but is this the right thing for me? Is this something that I can easily do on my own? So this is what's included in a test kit. You receive 2 little tubes. One is just backup in case the first try doesn't go as well as you would like. You receive some alcohol swabs, a couple of finger stick devices or lancets, and some rubber gloves and Band-Aids. All you have to do is, again, after prepping your kids for success with warm baths, hot showers, exercise, however you want to do it, you do a little finger stick. And then there is a tube that helps you to collect blood from the finger stick via capillary action. So you just put the tube up to the blood coming from the finger, and it drains into our collection tube. This tube in this picture here is very full. Most people don't collect that amount or that volume of blood. Usually if we can get it up to the top of that white sticker, we're good, and we'll have enough to check for all of the autoantibodies. Some people will also just scrape their finger along the top of the collection tube, and they're able to get a sufficient sample that way. Oh, okay. So we're already to our Jordan Morris story. We're doing well. So I do want to show a little video of one of the families that participated in TrialNet screening up here in Seattle. This video shows Jordan Morris. He's our forward for the Seattle Sounders. So we are big fans up here. You may not be as big of fans down in Portland, but I'm sure some of you have probably heard of Jordan Morris. So he's going to talk a little bit about his family's experience with antibody testing.
Growing up my whole life, Jordan was my #1 sports teammate, I think, in any sort of game.
Jordan hadn't been feeling well for months.
And I remember it was around Christmas time, so we were doing all of our Christmas traditions.
Christmas Day, we went to my mom's, and he kept going to the bathroom. The symptoms were getting worse and worse. He was thirsty all the time.
I was laying in my mom's lap. I just felt so sick. I assume I had a high blood sugar. Even at like a young age, I could tell something was wrong, and my parents were worried. And so I asked my mom, and she kind of said,
He probably had diabetes. And I kind of kept it to myself because it was Christmas break. And he said,
I was like, am I gonna die here?
And we said, no, why would you say that? And he said,
the word diabetes, part of it is die, and I didn't know what diabetes was.
He had never heard the word diabetes.
It was the day after Christmas.
Mike was such a rock and just said, you can do this, and it's going to be fine.
Yeah, I didn't know what to tell him, really. I mean, I knew it was not good, for sure.
I remember I had a soccer tournament that day.
Bless his little heart, he was in his little soccer outfit, and we both knew he wasn't going, but we didn't know what else to say to him because we had to get him to the doctors. So we took him, Mike got his blood drawn, and we brought him home to pack him up to go. I'll never forget, he gave him
waffles, scouse, and sugary with
syrup. Because he said, I don't know when the next time you're going to eat this is.
What I remember most is them coming to the hospital when I had to stay there for a few days. And
I do remember going to the hospital and seeing him in the bed, and it was kind of scary, but
we had planned to go see Lord of the Rings. I was wearing like my bracelet, and I think I had my pajamas with my gown on. Everyone was looking at me like.
I think once he knew he wasn't going to die and he knew he could play sports, I think he really got on board with it and was a champ.
So when I heard that, I was like, okay, this is all going to be okay. I can still do what I love. And
that he was going to be able to continue to do all the things that he wanted to do. That was the important thing for him.
I found that for Jordan, really, it hasn't slowed him down a second.
Realizing that whether or not your sibling is making things look easy, they've had a pretty dramatic change to their life. And putting yourself in their shoes sometimes really does make you appreciate them a little bit more and how tough they're being.
There's been good and bad things that have come out of this diagnosis.
To see my family be that supportive of this cause that's important to me is pretty special.
And I think that we just really want to support each other through anything.
I started talking to the kids about getting tested.
I remember vividly when my parents talked to me about type 1 diabetes.
I got screened with TrialNet about a year ago.
They've all three been tested, and they all are negative for autoantibodies.
I don't really know how to explain why this was, but the area where I got my blood drawn for TrialNet seemed way brighter and nicer and newer and cleaner than the rest of the areas of the hospital. And I was like, oh, this is such a good change.
Everyone was so nice there that I wasn't that nervous once I got there.
People were explaining the entire way why they were doing what they were doing, and walking through kind of the next steps with me.
After getting tested once, I'm not nervous about getting tested again.
To all those people considering taking part in diabetes research, I mean, first of all, obviously want to say thank you because it's very important. And second, it is going to be a group effort and people can't do it alone. So you getting out there and participating will make a huge difference.
It's pretty crazy to think that we would be considered heroes.
Hearing my family are considered research heroes makes me feel just happy because it's such a group effort with everything. I wouldn't be where I am with my diabetes in sports and life without my family. So to hear that they're part of this journey with me to find a cure for diabetes and continuing to research, and I mean, I have a tattoo on my arm that is for my family. It just means they're always with me because they are, and it's such a cool thing that it is a group effort to try and change the world and to try and find a cure. And their support has meant the world to me.
Okay. So that's Jordan. He's fantastic. He actually runs a soccer camp for kiddos with type 1 diabetes up here in the Seattle area. So also in the camp family, just a different genre, different brand of the camp family. So I did want to touch on what we do if someone tests positive, because obviously, you can understand how to do a test, you can understand how to ship it off. But a lot of people who do autoantibody testing assume that they'll be negative, right? And 95% of people who are tested for antibodies are negative. But for the 5% of people that are positive, this is something that can kind of catch them off guard. So what do we do? What do we do when someone tests positive for multiple autoantibodies? The first thing that we do is we monitor them closely for disease progression. We bring people in every 6 to 12 months at a TrialNet site. And again, OHSU is one. So many families are sent to that clinical site for their monitoring visits. We do A1C testing, we do glucose tolerance testing, and we recheck for antibodies to see if there's been any change. The benefits of doing this are that it really lowers the chance of DKA at diagnosis. People in our monitoring program have lower A1Cs when they're diagnosed, and with both of those changes, there's a decreased chance of hospitalization. Early detection of these autoantibodies also allows for early intervention. So for many of these families, we might offer treatment with therapies aimed at slowing the course of disease. And I'll talk about some of those in a second here. I also wanted to say that TrialNet now has an open door policy. So anyone who is identified as being autoantibody positive, even if they're identified as being so outside of TrialNet, can now be part of TrialNet's monitoring or prevention trials. They don't have to have a relative anymore to qualify for those services. And I wanted to put that out there because JDRF now has a program that is offering screening to people in the general population, regardless of whether or not they have family members. That program is called T1 Detect. So again, it's available to anyone. Many people who've screened positive through T1 Detect are then transferred over to TrialNet, where they can be monitored for disease progression. A lot of people also ask this question. I got this question at camp and put the slide up just for that reason. What if I'm positive for just one autoantibody? Then what? So again, we know that if you have two, there's almost a 100% chance that you'll eventually develop clinical type 1, but that's not necessarily the case for people who screen positive for just a single autoantibody. We do know that between 20 and 25% of people who test positive for just one autoantibody will develop a second or third or fourth or fifth autoantibody within 5 years. And then obviously, if they do develop a second autoantibody, they then are monitored through the monitoring program. Because there is that chance that they will progress to multiple autoantibody positivity, TrialNet recommends that these people come in once a year for antibody screening. Typically, we do see changes in antibodies before we see changes in blood sugar. So this is still considered to be a pretty conservative way to monitor for progression. People also ask, do I need to be screened again if I've tested negative for autoantibodies? And this answer recently changed. We used to recommend yearly rescreening for all relatives, but the answer is now no. And that is because after screening almost 300,000 relatives of people with type 1 for these antibodies, we've seen that the chance of developing type 1, if your initial screen is negative, is 1 in 300, which is not zero, but it's the same as the background risk in the general population. So I also wanted to talk about some pros and cons of testing. This can be a polarizing issue for people in the type 1 diabetes community. Not everybody wants to be tested for these autoantibodies. So I wanted to put some of the feedback, some of the concerns that we hear from participants or potential participants here. One of the biggest concerns we hear is this: if my child is going to get type 1 diabetes someday, I'd rather they have a little more time not having to think about this disease. Valid. Will my child and I be more anxious if they test positive? Testing can be uncomfortable and might be inconvenient. There aren't any FDA-approved treatments for people with preclinical type 1 diabetes, which is also very valid. So all of the therapies that we're using in order to delay progression right now are only offered as part of a clinical trial. There's not a medication that you can go in and get from your endocrinologist yet. Some people say, I just don't feel ready to know yet. Participating in TrialNet helps advance research to stop type 1 diabetes. If my child is positive, we can monitor them closely. They'll be less likely to have a high A1C or go into DKA to be hospitalized at diagnosis. And my child might be eligible for a prevention study to delay clinical diagnosis. If they test positive, we'll have time to prepare before they develop symptoms. If my child tests negative, I can relax about their type 1 diabetes risk. This one was a big one for me. I don't know any other type 1 diabetes parents. I have diabetes myself, so my situation's a little bit different. But knowing what my symptoms were before I was diagnosed, anytime one of my kiddos would go pee more than twice in a 30-minute period, I would be tempted to follow them around with my glucometer and try and check a blood sugar. So I did. I checked my own children for diabetes autoantibodies through TrialNet. They were all negative. I am now much less likely, I should say, to chase them around with that glucometer. And then the last one we often hear is knowledge is power. The more information I have about my child's health, the better I can care for their mental and physical health. And again, there's no right or wrong answer to this. People have different families, different family situations, different children, different diagnosis stories. So where they land along this spectrum is obviously going to be different. We're very happy to walk with people wherever they are at on the spectrum of how they feel about testing. So again, we're going back to our case study. When this family member asks, since I have a child with type 1, are my other family members at risk? We can answer yes, your other family members are at risk, and the ADA recommends that they be screened for autoantibodies. He then asks, okay, so if my family members test positive for antibodies, can we do anything for them to prevent type 1 diabetes? So we're going to talk a little bit about immunotherapy. We don't have a ton of time, so we'll just touch briefly on this. Immunotherapy is what we have used historically to delay or try and prevent type 1 diabetes. So this is from a book that my 4-year-old daughter really loves right now. You may recognize it. It's Dr. Seuss. We are going to consider this little man on the left to be representative of our beta cells. And the creature in the middle is representing our immune system, those autoreactive T cells, right? And if we know the immune system is attacking our beta cells, the best way we know to tamp down the immune system is to use immunotherapy or immunosuppressive therapy. We have done that. In new onset studies, we've actually had 8 different therapies that have been effective in preserving beta cell function in people with a new diagnosis of diabetes. And those are listed here on the right. So one thought is that we can take these same therapies and we can move them upstream. Will they be more effective if we give them to people before they develop symptoms of diabetes? You know, before they get to the point where they only have 20% of their beta cells that are still functional. And we've actually already had success with one of the therapies on the last page. The medication was called teplizumab, and it helped us to delay progression from stage 2 to stage 3 diabetes. When we gave this immunotherapy to people with autoantibodies, we saw a 3-year delay in the progression to clinical type 1 diabetes. Teplizumab is also called anti-CD3, and how it works is to inactivate those autoreactive T cells. So anti-CD3 or teplizumab is represented by the little green images. What the medication does is it fits onto one of the cell surface proteins and prevents the T cells from being able to communicate to other immune cells. And that stops the immune cascade that eventually leads to type 1 diabetes or beta cell destruction. When we inactivate those T cells, we have fewer T cells that are going forth and attacking our beta cells. So we do have success in preserving beta cell function. TrialNet's prevention study tested this medication in 76 people. All of these people were relatives of people with diabetes, and all of them had 2 or more autoantibodies and abnormal glucose tolerance. So these people had stage 2 diabetes. It's also notable that most of them were children. Most of them were under 18 years old. What we did is we brought all of our participants in, and they either received 14 days of infusions with teplizumab or 14 days of infusions with placebo. And then we followed those people for an average of 2 to 3 years for beta cell function. What we saw was that there was a really big delay in type 1 diabetes in the first year after people received therapy. So the top, the little black people are those that received placebo. And you can see that after a year, 44% progressed to clinical type 1. And in the bottom, the little purple people represent those that received teplizumab. Only 7% progressed to clinical type 1 diabetes. And again, after following these people for 2 to 3 years, we saw a 3-year delay in the development of type 1 diabetes. So this was a huge step. This was really big in the diabetes research world because it's the only time we've ever been able to do this with an immunotherapy. We were able to show that the onset of disease can be delayed in people before they develop symptoms. And this medication is actually at the FDA right now. So they will make a decision about whether or not this is something that will be approved for the treatment of preclinical type 1 by November 17th. So on November 17th, be listening for news coming from JDRF, ADA. I'm sure you will be hearing about whether or not this has been approved. All right, so building on teplizumab's success, we know we can delay the progression of type 1 diabetes. We need more prevention trials. We should be testing the other therapies that have already worked in new onset type 1 diabetes. And these should look familiar. We should be looking at new and novel therapies that have been designed for use in type 1 diabetes specifically. And we are doing that. We've done that with oral insulin. And we're looking at using a plasmid therapy for the same purpose in the future. And then we should be looking at therapies that work in other autoimmune conditions, right? The pathophysiology behind many of our autoimmune diseases is similar. So if a medication works in rheumatoid arthritis, that medication could also work in type 1 diabetes. So we're looking at some of these therapies for type 1. And we're evaluating hydroxychloroquine for that right now. All right. Stay tuned. Another prevention trial will be available soon through TrialNet. It is not yet IRB approved, but hopefully will be shortly. So in the next year or so, we hope to have another prevention study available to people who are multiple autoantibody positive. So again, we go back to our case study. If my family members test positive for antibodies, can we do anything for them to prevent type 1? We answer that we've already delayed type 1 with teplizumab, but it's not yet FDA approved. Other diabetes prevention trials are enrolling. So I just want to end by saying that it has been slow. Research always seems to move more slowly than we would like, but let's look at the progress that we've made, even in the past 100 years, in the past 50 years. We've made so much progress. We used to have to boil our urine to know what our blood glucose levels are. And now we have CGMs, we have automated dosing. We can look at our phone and see our blood glucose. This is an old antiquated Lancet. Now we have much more gentle, much more user-friendly devices. This is the first insulin pump. This is something that came forward in the 1960s. It was huge, and now we have small little handheld devices. And this is the first child to receive insulin. He lived into his 30s, which is obviously longer than he would have lived without therapy. But life expectancy today and quality of life today is so much better than it was 100 years ago. And that's thanks to research. This is one of our research trial participants. You can see her little Omnipod CGM on her abdomen, and she is a professional dancer. And she wears it well. So we hope someday when we say your child has antibodies for type 1 diabetes, we will also be able to say, but we have therapies to prevent disease progression. Here's what we're going to do next. Again, we focused a lot on TrialNet on antibody testing tonight. I did want to point out that we also have trials for people with new onset diabetes. We have 3 that are recruiting for people within 4 years of diagnosis right now. We have our bridge study that is always available to people with longstanding type 1 diabetes. And we're always looking at enrolling people in autoantibody screening and monitoring programs. And again, this is something that's available at OHSU. So it's right in your backyard. This is our clinical team. And I think hopefully we do have a little bit of time for questions. If you guys have any comments, if you want to share your experience, if you've been tested yourself or have tested your children through TrialNet.
Thank you, Dana. My name is Kendra Lodewick, and I don't have a lot to do today because you've done such a great presentation, and I think this conversation will probably take care of itself with questions. But I'll share a little bit just because I was eager to hear this conversation because my mom has type 1. She had got type 1 when she was 27. So that was before I was born. So since I was born, she's always had type 1. And I did a TrialNet study, and it's really interesting to hear about when these new kind of the new markers or antibodies were discovered, because I did type 1, or I did the TrialNet like 20, probably it was over 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. My sister and I both did. Neither of us have type 1. And neither of us had any markers at that time. My guess is it was really different what they were looking for then versus now. And then, fast forward to when my husband and I had kids, and all 3 of our kids do have type 1. So it's just really interesting. And I've always been wondering, like, I wonder if they could go back to the sample I gave then and repurpose it for what they know now. I haven't done a fresh sample because I guess I just haven't, but that's just a little bit of my own TrialNet story, because I was interested to hear sort of clearly there's advances since I participated in the study.
Yeah, but that's a great historical perspective. And thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny because I'm now over 45, as is my husband. So we're not eligible to participate, but I'm like, as someone who does applied research, I'm like, I would really want to know about us because we have 3 kids who all have it. And is there something about our, I'm curious, if we have no markers and they had obviously, but anyway, that's aside from that, as a different story. But yeah, it's been really interesting to hear, how things have advanced and what can be done. But we did not have any of our daughter was diagnosed first. We did not have either of the other 2 tested, not because we were opposed to it. It was just sort of a matter of lack of inertia, not getting around to getting it done. We were living down in Eugene at the time. It was more of an effort to do it. And then, it became pretty evident in pretty short order that they both have it. So other people have questions for Dana based on either your experiences or her presentation?
I had a couple questions. The first one, so the immunotherapies, does that make you immunocompromised at that point? Does that suppress your immune system enough that you would have, is it kind of a trade-off? Now my immune system doesn't work as well, but I've delayed type 1.
Sure. So that's a great question. When we say immunotherapy, we use the term very broadly. So some immunotherapies are not immunosuppressants. For instance, we're looking at a plasmid, which is a little circular piece of DNA. We inject it and it encodes for different proteins that are specific to type 1 diabetes. Those proteins are aimed at teaching the immune system not to react to the beta cell, but they don't immunosuppress you in any way, shape, or form. It's still an immunotherapy. That said, many immunotherapies are immunosuppressants. So then you are, right, kind of trading one thing for another. Most of the immunosuppressants that we're working with are pretty gentle. They're not broad spectrum immunosuppressants. So your risk for things like the common cold may increase if you're on therapy. For instance, abatacept is one of the therapies that we're looking at for type 1. It's something that's also used in rheumatoid arthritis. And it's been used throughout the pandemic for kiddos who have RA, but we haven't seen an increase in COVID in those kiddos, despite the fact that we're giving them an immunosuppressant therapy. So there are big guns, right, with our immunotherapies or our immunosuppressants, and there are little guns. And most of the ones that we're using for type 1 diabetes are considered to be little guns. Yeah.
And then my other question was, so we got my daughter tested, she's 4, and she tested negative for antibodies. Does it matter when you test? Like, would her risk likely be 1 in 300, or because she's 4,
Right.
is it good to get her tested when she's a little bit older? My son was diagnosed at 8.
Okay. And that's a good question. I'll give you the answer I'm supposed to give, and then I'll give you anecdotally what I've done and what I think personally. The answer I'm supposed to give is that if you test negative, your risk is low enough that retesting is not clinically indicated. However, she's only 4 years old. A lot of the research that we've seen has shown that if you test someone before they're 5, we might miss antibodies, right? So my gentle recommendation to people who test their children very young is to consider rechecking in a few years. Now, you can only do it once through TrialNet, right? But you can do it through your daughter's pediatrician, her PCP. You can do it through GADRF's T1 Detect program. And again, if she tests positive through that program, she can be rolled back into TrialNet, and they will welcome her with open arms. But yeah, I also tested my daughter when she was like barely 2.5, and she was negative, but we're planning on testing her again when she's over 5. Just to confirm that negative antibody test. It's a good question. And Kendra, I was going to offer too, you and your husband could be tested for antibodies through T1 Detect as well.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's something.
I'm just curious, actually.
Yeah.
It's more like I'm curious, especially given that, when I did the TrialNet years ago, it was negative. So maybe it still is. It's just,
well, and years ago it was called the DPT1, the Diabetes Prevention Trial 1. And we didn't even recognize all of the antibodies that we currently test for. Right. So it may be that you would have tested positive, but they didn't have the zinc antibody yet, so it would be interesting to know, I think, too.
I have maybe is a silly question, but a few years ago, I went to a JDRF research update, and they talked about just that they were discovering so much more about what leads to type 1, and I swear the guy said that there can be considered 5 different kinds of type 1. And because there was this 5 different antibodies thing, I wondered if that's somehow related, or if I just misheard that. I mean, it was years ago and I was fairly new to the scene, so I heard a lot of things that were incorrect, I'm sure. But is that a thing? Are there different types of type 1?
Yeah, so that's a great question. That is not a stupid question. I'll start off by saying that I don't think the different types of type 1 are associated with the 5 different antibodies. That's a coincidence that there's 5 of each. But there are lots of scientists looking at what we call diabetes endotypes. And we're trying to understand why diabetes in one person looks different than diabetes in another person. Why does diabetes in children progress so much more rapidly than it does in people who are diagnosed over 30? Why do some people with type 1 diabetes have GAD and MIAA antibodies, and others have completely different autoantibody subsets? So there is a lot of data mining and a lot of work that's being done in trying to identify if there are multiple different types of type 1 diabetes that we don't recognize. because when all is said and done, all of the types of diabetes are going to lead to the same symptoms, right? And they're going to need the same therapies right now. So for a long time, we haven't been looking more closely at that because we have to treat all of the types of diabetes with the same therapies. But yeah, I absolutely think there are different endotypes. There are different pathways to type 1 diabetes. That's something that I don't know if you've heard of the TEDdy study or the SEARCH study. Both of those trials are looking at that. If there are different causes and different why diabetes looks different in different people. So it's a great question. It's one that I can't even answer. So it's not a stupid question at all.
Are there many people who are diagnosed over 30? I kind of thought that my husband and I were like past, we didn't need to get tested. We're like, we haven't, developed diabetes now. Yeah, is the risk, still pretty.
There are. I know. So we used to think that diabetes was a disease of childhood, right? And we had the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation that was later renamed because we recognized that more and more adults were being diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. But it's more than 50% of people with type 1 will be diagnosed over age 21. So yeah, we saw someone who was in her 60s and just diagnosed with type 1 diabetes the other day. So the risk does seem to drop the older you get, right? If you get to the point where you're 45 years old and you don't yet have type 1 diabetes, your risk is going to be below that 1 in 300 risk. But I was diagnosed at 22, and that's a similar story to many of my coworkers. And we see people all the time who are diagnosed in their 30s, to be honest. So
I'll just say, just an observation that I was also curious to hear, and I've heard this through other friends who've had their children tested through TrialNet, but that once you get to having those 5 markers, that it is much more certainty that you will be diagnosed. And that I know that that's not the case when you just have 1 or 2 or 3, and that's maybe where there's still the room for like, yeah, you have these, but you may never develop it because you still have, even if it's a narrowing percentage of your likelihood of not getting it. But I was curious, or it was curious for me to hear that if you have all 5 of them, it's pretty, I don't know if you'd say a guarantee, but it's statistically likely that you will definitely be diagnosed at some point.
Yeah, I will say if you have all 5, you're more likely to be diagnosed more quickly. If you have just 2 though, that's still almost a 100%
okay
that you'll eventually get it.
Maybe so I was conflating those 2 charts then. Yeah.
Because the person I mentioned who's had multiple antibodies for 16 years, he is very much in the majority. He's an outlier. Yeah. Usually people progress more rapidly than that, especially with 3 autoantibodies.
Yeah.
But yeah, most people, if they even have just 2, after a couple of decades, they're going to have type 1, usually sooner than that, usually within a decade.
So the autoantibodies are pretty conclusive, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm. They're conclusive enough that the ADA just rewrote their standards of care in recent years to say that 2 autoantibodies is now diabetes. We can diagnose type 1 just based on antibodies, even if people's blood sugar is completely normal by all of our metrics, even if they have no symptoms whatsoever, it's still considered to be type 1.
So do you expect that because of that, the rewriting of that there will be an increased, increased attention or increased draws for this, like in a more standardized, with more like, will this be, how you have like standard panels done in blood tests, and you don't do that as much as a kid, you're not having your blood drawn frequently, but will this, do you expect that may change behaviors in terms of drawing that as a standardized test that people do?
I do. And some countries are already looking at that. Germany has a study or a program called the Frida trial, and they're testing all 5-year-olds, regardless of whether or not they have relatives. Everybody's getting tested. If they have autoantibodies, then they get further counseling and monitoring. But we're looking at probably 20 years from now, maybe, if I'm optimistic, 10, before we have something like that that's being done in the United States. There was just a study published, I think, in Diabetes Care, but don't quote me on the journal, and they were trying to find what ages would be best and most financially realistic, I guess, for our healthcare system to recommend screening kiddos for these autoantibodies. And that paper was recommending that we do it twice, once when kiddos are under 5, and I think the second age was around 8, to make sure that we don't miss people, even if they're negative the first time that we screen. So we're working on it. There are groups of people working on what the recommendations would even look like. But yes, I think that eventually it will be clinically indicated. It's expensive. It would not be cheap. Each antibody test is about $150 to run just for one antibody, not for all 5. So there are some people who are saying, well, let's do a genetic screening first, and let's take all of the people that have genetic markers, genetic risk markers for type 1, and then let's just check that population for autoantibodies. And that would be a more conservative way to use our healthcare dollars. But exactly, because that financial barrier is a big one, unfortunately. So yeah, I wish we could screen everyone. I really do. And follow up with the families that test positive, make sure that their kiddos get monitoring, because we know that that plays a big role in keeping people out of the hospital, and just giving them time to get used to the fact that they have type 1 diabetes before. I mean, when people are diagnosed, you know this, it's like drinking from a fire hose for the first month or so. And you have to learn so much so quickly. But people who are monitored and counseled through programs like Frida in Germany, right, they have time to learn about diabetes, learn what it is, learn different options for how they'll be able to take care of their diabetes, how to recognize symptoms. And it's a much softer way to be diagnosed. So,
yeah, you could almost say, if you have certain close relations in your family, like if your parent has diabetes, then they should almost automatically be covered for a test, instead of doing genetic markers even. But I don't know, like we have, obviously our healthcare system needs a lot of, improvement in different ways. But I want to say thank you. It is 8:03, and we love to respect everyone's time and appreciate just the moment that we're together. And so I really, really thank you for being here again with us, Dana, spending some time here. And she even came out to camp this summer, which was so fun. So we hopefully you can come out again and get another t-shirt, and that's all we got. We got nothing else. We got a t-shirt and really a lot of thank yous and appreciation.
It's my favorite pajama shirt, I will say. I wear it most nights. So awesome. I will happily come and get another one.
Cool. All right.